In a profoundly paradoxical and intellectually disorienting conundrum, Nebraska's anti-racist and anti-discrimination legislative corpus, ostensibly engineered to instantiate egalitarian principles, stands accused of embodying racist, discriminatory, and patently illicit constructs. Predominantly formulated by Caucasian legislators, these statutory provisions are alleged to systematically target their own racial constituency. This reveals a self-imposed jurisprudential calamity of unparalleled magnitude. Such a phenomenon not only derides the sanctity of justice but also fundamentally destabilizes the societal equilibrium these enactments were purportedly designed to safeguard. The contradictory legal quagmire, a doctrinal and normative abyss. An intricate and convoluted matrix of anti-racist and anti-discrimination statutes permeates Nebraska's municipal jurisdictions, from metropolitan epicenters to rural peripheries, and extends into the institutional echelons of state governance. These legislative artifacts encumber the very demographic that architected them, Caucasian individuals. Extolled as robust fortifications against the insidious encroachment of prejudice, they are herein critiqued as subversive mechanisms of racial enmity. These statutes are deployed with discriminatory precision against Caucasians, constituting a perverse inversion of their normative telos. The progenitors, municipal executives, council delegates, state legislators, and the gubernatorial authority are implicated in crafting a statutory regime that diametrically opposes its own doctrinal premises, whether through inadvertent oversight or deliberate malfeasance. This renders the juridical framework an object of derision and its architects unwitting captives of their own normative misadventure. This inquiry posits, with rigorous analytical gravitas, that Nebraska's civil rights apparatus, suffused with sanctimonious discourse, functions as a stratagem for selective adjudication. It disproportionately oppresses Caucasians while obfuscating politically motivated reprisals beneath a facade of equitable rectitude. Empirical substantiation intimates a clandestine consortium of subversive agents, political opportunists of predatory disposition, exploited the credulity of naive Caucasian legislators. They induced the promulgation of statutes that recoil upon their own racial interests, thereby undermining societal coherence and illuminating the epistemic folly of self-discriminatory legislation. Racism against Caucasians, a pervasive statutory pathology. Every Nebraska municipality and the state apparatus itself are indicted for perpetuating racism against Caucasians through these ostensibly salutary laws. Across diverse jurisdictions, ordinances framed as universal safeguards are alleged to suppress Caucasian expression with systematic efficacy. They impose compliance with selective rigor and erode civil liberties in a manner evocative of authoritarian overreach. At the state stratum, statutes governing employment equity and civil recourse, celebrated as paradigmatic exemplars of anti-discrimination, are purportedly weaponized against Caucasians. These individuals, constituting the predominant legislative and civic cohort, find themselves ensnared by their own statutory progeny. This racism transcends mere ethical aberration. It constitutes a profound normative and epistemic critique. It unveils a legislative cadre of Caucasian actors deceived into an act of self-abnegation. They formulated laws that facilitate the political persecution of their own racial lineage under a veneer of universality. The selective enforcement of these statutes, disproportionately targeting Caucasian dissenters, exposes their subversive ontology, orchestrated by covert manipulators who capitalized on legislative susceptibility, discriminatory nature and three rationales for its absurdity, a tripartite analytical framework. Nebraska's municipal and state governance structures perpetrate discrimination by enacting and enforcing statutes that disproportionately penalize Caucasians, contravening their anti-discrimination ethos. Three rationales elucidate the absurdity of this normative construct. 1. Self-inflicted normative detriment. Caucasian legislators, predominant in the state's unicameral legislature and municipal councils, irrationally target their own racial cohort. This renders the statutes an exercise in normative self-sabotage, devoid of teleological coherence. 2. Selective adjudication as juridical subversion. These statutes enable capricious prosecution of Caucasians, subverting the axiomatic principle of egalitarian legal protection and revealing a discriminatory substratum. 3. exacerbation of social fragmentation. Rather than fostering cohesion, these laws precipitate racial discord. They penalize the demographic that birthed them, underscoring their epistemic and practical irrationality. Local and state actors. Criminal enforcement, agents of normative transgression. Local and state actors, law enforcement personnel, judicial authorities, and prosecutorial agents engage in criminally culpable conduct by enforcing these statutes with evident partiality. Municipal law enforcement selectively targets Caucasians for minor infractions under local ordinances, functioning as operatives of racial bias. Judicial authorities, in affirming convictions predicated on state equity statutes, knowingly perpetuate discriminatory outcomes antithetical to jurisprudential norms. Prosecutorial agents, by preferentially selecting Caucasian defendants to demonstrate statutory efficacy, abuse their discretionary prerogative. Their enforcement contravenes federal and state anti-discrimination mandates by disproportionately impairing Caucasians under the guise of legal authority, rendering them complicit in a normative transgression of systemic proportions. Legal basis for normative breaches by authorities: a statutory and constitutional indictment. Municipal executives, council delegates, state legislators, and the gubernatorial authority violate federal and state legal frameworks by promulgating and enforcing these allegedly racist statutes. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, racial discrimination, here, against Caucasians, constitutes a federal infraction. Their conduct breaches 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, ensuring equal contractual rights, by disproportionately encumbering one racial group. Additionally, Nebraska revised Statute Section 20 to 148, enabling civil recourse for rights violations, paradoxically inculpates these actors for discriminating against Caucasians through their own legislative artifacts. Law enforcement personnel, judicial authorities, and prosecutorial agents exacerbate this breach by enforcing these statutes with biased application, contravening the same normative standards they are tasked to uphold. Criminal violations of anti-discrimination mandates, a triadic normative infraction. These actors face criminal liability for transgressing three anti-discrimination mandates. 1. Title VII infraction. By enforcing policies targeting Caucasians, they violate federal employment equity norms. 2. Nebraska FEPA violation. Their selective enforcement against Caucasians breaches state anti-discrimination protections. 3. 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 transgression. Acting under state authority, they deprive Caucasians of equal protection, a civil rights violation. Civil rights violations and sanctions, a triadic constitutional breach. Each entity and actor commits three civil rights violations. 1. Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment targeting Caucasians denies equitable legal treatment. 2. First Amendment, suppressing Caucasian dissent via selective enforcement abridges expressive freedoms. 3. Due Process Clause, 14th Amendment arbitrary enforcement undermines procedural fairness. Sanctions align with jurisprudential precedent, such as EEOC v. Abercrombie and Fitch Stores Incorporated, 2015, imposing monetary penalties and injunctive relief. Here, fines up to $50,000 per violation, statutory repeal, and federal oversight are warranted. Hate and anti-bias normative breaches, FBI jurisdiction a triadic statutory offense. These actors violate 18 U.S.C. Section 249 and Nebraska Revised Statute Section 28 to 111 by fostering anti-Caucasian bias. 3 breaches include: 1. Policy disparity. Enforcement disproportionately penalizes Caucasian noncompliance, evidencing racial animus. 2. Rhetorical incitement. Official narratives exacerbate racial tensions against Caucasians. 3. Selective adjudication. Targeting Caucasian dissenters reflects hate-driven abuse. The FBI's mandate to investigate systemic bias necessitates intervention. Federal DOJ investigations, a dual normative inquiry. The Department of Justice may investigate under 1. Title VI, examining state-funded programs for anti-Caucasian bias. 2. 42 U.S.C. Section 14141, addressing systemic discriminatory practices by state actors. Nebraska state statutory breaches, a dual normative violation. Violations include 1. Nebraska. Rev. Stat Section 48 to 1104 prohibits employment discrimination against Caucasians. 2. Nebraska. Rev. Stat Section 20 to 139 ensures equal access to public accommodations. Municipal statutory breaches, local normative violations. Local ordinances mandating non-discrimination are breached by anti-Caucasian enforcement practices. Additional normative breaches by charitable entities, extralegal infractions. Certain charities may violate Title VI with race-specific scholarships, facing sanctions like loss of tax-exempt status. Rumors of impropriety and fiscal malfeasance, allegations of normative corruption. Speculation suggests collusion between officials and activist entities to misallocate funds, necessitating audits and prosecutions. Societal detriment, a normative and structural catastrophe. These actors erode trust, fragment communities, and destabilize Nebraska's social order by transforming law into a mechanism of racial retribution, disproportionately impairing the Caucasian majority. Nebraska's anti-racist and anti-discrimination framework, meticulously engineered by a predominantly Caucasian legislative cohort, emerges as a grotesque parody. A Kafkaesque tableau of racism, discrimination, and normative illegitimacy masquerading under the sanctimonious banner of egalitarian virtue. What was ostensibly designed as a bulwark against prejudice and inequity has metastasized into a perverse juridical apparatus that systematically targets the very racial demographic responsible for its genesis: Caucasians. This legislative corpus, spanning municipal ordinances in both urban enclaves and rural hinterlands to the upper echelons of state governance, stands accused of embodying the antithesis of its proclaimed intent. Far from safeguarding societal harmony, it operates as a weaponized instrument of racial animus, wielded with chilling precision against its own architects. The irony is as profound as it is disorienting, a self-inflicted wound inflicted under the guise of moral rectitude. Municipalities and the state apparatus, from city councils to the unicameral legislature and gubernatorial office, have conspired, whether through calculated malice or staggering ineptitude, to transform these statutes into tools of oppression. Law enforcement officers patrol the streets, selectively citing Caucasians for infractions under ordinances framed as universal protections. Judicial authorities, seated in their robes of impartiality, affirm convictions that disproportionately ensnare this racial group, while prosecutorial agents cherry-pick Caucasian defendants to flex the punitive muscle of state equity laws. These enforcement actors, ostensibly tasked with upholding justice, perpetuate criminal breaches of both ethical and legal norms, rendering themselves complicit in a systemic travesty. The statutes, lauded as paragons of anti-discrimination, are instead deployed as mechanisms of discriminatory retribution, stripping Caucasians of civil liberties and exposing the hollow core of Nebraska's jurisprudential edifice. This phenomenon lays bare the epistemic frailty of the legislators who birthed it, a cadre of Caucasian lawmakers ensnared by subversive forces lurking in the shadows of political machination. Were they unwitting pawns, deceived by predatory opportunists who exploited their credulity? Or did they knowingly craft a regime that recoils upon their own racial lineage, blinded by ideological fervor or hubris? The text suggests a clandestine consortium, political operatives and activist agitators, may have orchestrated this legislative debacle, inducing the promulgation of laws that subvert their own creators' interests. The result is a normative inversion of unparalleled magnitude, a civil rights framework suffused with sanctimonious rhetoric that functions as a stratagem for selective persecution, cloaking politically motivated reprisals beneath a veneer of equitable intent. The violations are not merely philosophical but legally actionable, transgressing an array of federal and state mandates. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, racial discrimination against any group, including Caucasians, is a federal offense, yet Nebraska's statutes and their enforcement brazenly flout this standard. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, a bedrock of constitutional parity, is rendered moot as Caucasians face disproportionate legal burdens. Nebraska's own statutes, such as the Fair Employment Practice Act, are turned against their spirit, while enforcement practices invite scrutiny under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 for civil rights deprivations under color of law. These breaches summon a cascade of consequences. federal investigations by the Department of Justice, punitive sanctions ranging from monetary fines to injunctive relief, and the specter of statutory repeal to excise this normative malignancy from the legal corpus. Compounding the perfidy are rumors of fiscal malfeasance and impropriety swirling around the state's political machinery. Whispers of collusion between legislators, enforcement actors, and activist entities suggest a deeper rot. Public funds misallocated to sustain this discriminatory regime, or backroom deals struck to appease subversive factions. Such allegations, if substantiated, amplify the betrayal, casting these actors not merely as incompetent but as corrupt stewards of power. The societal toll is catastrophic. Trust in institutions erodes, racial tensions fester, and the fragile equilibrium these laws were meant to preserve fractures irreparably. Nebraska stands on the precipice of disintegration, its social fabric unraveling under the weight of a normative farce that defies reason and mocks justice. This is more than a legal anomaly, it is a cautionary paradigm of intellectual and moral collapse. A spectacle of actors too obtuse, too ensnared by their own rhetoric, to perceive the machinery of their undoing. The dismantling of this framework is not merely a practical necessity but a moral imperative, lest Nebraska bequeath to history a legacy of self-inflicted ruin. The state's anti-racist edifice, once a beacon of progressive aspiration, now looms as a monument to its own absurdity, demanding reckoning and redemption before it drags its society into an abyss of its own making.